The Evolution of Civilizations by Carroll Quigley. Read, recorded, and produced by JohnLothe. Chapter 10, Part 3. Third Age of Expansion. The Third Age of Expansion lasted from about 1730 to about 1929, although indications of a new age of conflict began to appear as early as 1890. Its instrument of expansion remained capitalistic, but operating in fields other than those that had become institutionalized in the earlier age of conflict of the late 17th century. The reappearance of expansion clearly resulted from circumvention of this previous organization. Again, the period of expansion can be divided into substages that make the process of expansion appear as a series of steps or surges. We might list these steps as follows. 1. The Agricultural Revolution from 1730. 2. The Industrial Revolution from 1770. 3. Financial Capitalism from 1850. And 4. Monopoly Capitalism from 1900. Naturally, the dates listed are very rough, because the advent of these steps is quite different in various areas. We have already indicated the nature of the agricultural revolution as a reform of the institutionalized medieval three-field fallow system. Its roots go back many generations, but it began to operate as a significant expansive force in England about 1730. It is, of course, one of the most important events in modern history. Two revolutionary events of the later 18th century contributed a good deal toward the new age of expansion. These were the Transportation Revolution, which began about 1750, and the Population Revolution, which began about a generation later. The Transportation Revolution consisted of a series of innovations that provided A. An effective traveling coach, B. Hard-surfaced all-weather roads, C. Canals, D. Telegraphic communication, and E. Railroads. All these appeared in the century 1750 to 1850. In the following century, the revolution in transportation and communications continued with the advent of F. High-speed printing presses, G. The internal combustion engine, leading to automobiles and airplanes, and H. Electricity, leading to radio and motion picture and television. The population revolution began about 1780 with the use of vaccination for smallpox. It continued with the discovery of germ infection and the invention of antiseptics by Pasteur and Lister, as well as improvements in surgery, such as the discovery of ether. Evidences of this kind have continued with accelerating rapidity and have given rise to a population explosion resulting from a drastic reduction in the death rates far sharper than the slight decreases in birth rates. The transportation and population revolutions occurred most conveniently between the agricultural and industrial revolutions in Western civilization, each of the four providing a sound basis for the next. This was quite different from the experience of the non-Western world, where these and other revolutionary advances diffused in a quite different sequence that was far better fitted to raising problems than to solving them. The Industrial Revolution, which we have defined as production by energy coming through non-living mechanisms, that is, from water power or steam rather than from men or animals, is familiar to all of us. Accordingly, we shall refer only to certain organizational features that help to distinguish its earlier period of owner management from its second period of financial capitalism. In the former, the typical pattern of organization was the private firm or partnership, with both capital and decision-making supplied by the owners. In the latter, the typical form of organization was the limited liability corporation and the holding company, in which capital came from the owners, but decision-making came from the management. As is well known, the Industrial Revolution first flourished in textile, using either water power or steam engines. Even when it spread into mining and iron making, the older form of proprietorship or partnership continued to prevail. But gradually, it spread into the activities of the still expanding transportation revolution. There, in canal building, and above all, in railroad building, it became impossible to continue to use the partnership form of business organization because the needs for capital were far greater than could be satisfied by the savings of any group of partners. The corporate form of enterprise was adopted for these activities because it could mobilize the savings of many in the control of a few, and do so with limited liability for the many. First used on a large scale in railroads, it soon spread into coal mining, iron making, and machine building. This change led to the period of financial capitalism that began about 1850 and died a violent death about September 1931, with the collapse of the international gold standard. As the period developed, the need for capital by corporations became so great that specialized capital-raising organizations appeared. These investment bankers, in return for their services, obtained representation on the boards of directors of corporations and sufficient influence to direct their companies' financial services and purchases toward other corporations, where the particular investment bankers concerned had interests. From this there grew up a network of interlocking directorships, but I repeat myself. From this there grew up a network of interlocking directorships and banking influences, and finally an elaborate system of holding companies and financial firms. These growing monopolistic influences were centralized by the joint concern which all financiers had in keeping the value of money high, or stabilized as they called it. This joint concern was reflected in the appearance of a joint organization, the central bank, which held the gold reserves that became the central feature of the monetary system. The international gold standard became the chief mechanism by which the supply of money could be kept low and its value, accordingly, kept high. A high value of money, which implies a low supply of money, was chiefly advantageous to creditors, to whom obligations were owed in monetary terms. But such a high value of money clearly meant low prices of goods, and was a disadvantage to debtors and to manufacturers of goods. Thus there appeared a dichotomy between bankers and industrialists, with one eager for a high value of money and high interest rates, while the other was eager for high prices of goods, thus low value of money and low interest rates. For a long time the dichotomy between the two did not come into the open because bankers succeeded in befuddling industrialists on financial matters, presenting them as abstruse subjects in which the industrialist's wisest course would be to follow his banker's advice. As long as the industrialist was dependent upon the banker for capital, he had to use that advice, even when he sometimes suspected that the interests of the two were not identical. But few industrialists before Henry Ford even realized that the interests of bankers and industrialists were opposed. This opposition of interests between the two appeared most clearly when there was an insufficient supply of money for the growing industrial structure. This insufficient supply of money was based on the insufficient supply of gold, since the bankers controlled the supply of money through the mechanism of the gold standard. The bankers called the use of the gold standard stabilization, and insisted that it provided a stable value to money. It did no such thing, but rather provided stable foreign exchanges for all currencies based on gold, and a growing value to money. The growing value to money on the gold standard occurred because the supply of money could not increase as rapidly as the supply of goods when the former was based on output of the world's gold mines, and the latter was based on the much more expandable industrial system. Accordingly, the overall tendency was for prices to soften during the whole period 1770 to 1931, except when there were sudden increases in the world's gold supplies, notably in 1848 to 1852 and 1896 to 1904, or when political events, such as wars, made it necessary to suspend the gold standard or to destroy quantities of goods, as in 1792 to 1815, 1861 to 1872, and 1914 to 1919. Outside these exceptional events, the general tendency of the price history of the Third Age of Expansion was deflationary, as was evident in 1816 to 1848, 1872 to 1896, 1920 to 1933. This tendency led, in each deflationary substage, to growing depression and to increasing agrarian and labor unrest associated with such historic labels as the Hungry Forties, the Populist Movement, and the Great World Depression. The tendency generally benefited bankers and injured industry by increasing the value of money and the costs of credit and making profitable industrial operations more difficult, since falling prices force businessmen to incur costs on an earlier and higher price level than that on which they must subsequently offer their product for sale. In these deflationary periods, as low prices drove corporations to bankruptcy, bankers were able to assume control of them, to consolidate them into larger units of monopolized industry, and to reap the profits of reorganization and reflotation of securities. Although these industrialists and businessmen generally accepted the bankers' justifications of these events, debtors, especially farmers and workers who suffered unemployment, were increasingly resentful. The first deflationary period, leading to the disturbances of the late 1840s, and the second, leading to the disturbances of the early 1890s, were both ended by the discovery of new gold supplies in California and Australia in 1848 to 1850, and in South Africa and the Klondikes in 1897 to 1900. In addition, the supply of gold, in the second case, was increased by new methods of extracting gold from its ores. But none of these occurred in the third deflationary period, 1919 to 1931, and financial capitalism, long threatened by its own creation, monopoly capitalism, perished in 1931 to 1933. As a consequence, the domination of economic life by financial figures such as Rothschild, Morgan, Maribond, Baring, Montague Norman, or even Ivan Kruger, was ended and replaced by great figures of monopoly capitalism like DuPont, Melcher, Leverhulme, Rockefeller, Ford, Newfield, and others. In this connection, however, it should be pointed out that the typical figure of monopoly capitalism is not the individual captain of industry of the earlier period, but the anonymously managed superfirm like United Shoe Machinery, IG Farben Industry, Unilever, DuPont, Chemicals, Hartford Empire, Alcoa, Volkswagen, Pechenay, General Motors, General Electric, or General Dynamics. It should also be noted that the generally deflationary character of the 19th century had certain beneficial aspects, such as wider distribution of goods at lower prices, and above all, the drastic need to lower costs of production by greater productive efficiency in order to ensure continued profits in a soft price era. These two aspects of the period explain why the 19th century remained an age of expansion in spite of its adjustment difficulties. It is not necessary to point out that the general characteristics we have posited for an age of expansion were in full flower during the 19th century. Geographic expansion was resumed so that Africa, the polar regions, the Mato Grosso, and New Guinea became familiar areas. Population soared. Production increased, even in periods of falling prices. Knowledge expanded beyond any one person's comprehension. Even democracy and science reached their greatest victories. Indeed, the 19th century, in terms of our description of an age of expansion, could be the age of expansion par excellence. In the military and political levels, the third age of expansion was associated with such familiar historical developments as the massed citizen army, the national state, and democracy. The shift of these from the older stages of these levels generally occurred during the era of the French Revolution and Napoleon. The reasons for these changes should be examined because, while often mentioned, they are rarely analyzed. The second age of conflict had been associated with the professional mercenary army, the dynastic monarchy, and authoritarian government. On the economic and social levels, it had been associated with mercantilism and the supremacy of the bureaucracy. As is well known, these last two stages were replaced, on their respective levels, by laissez-faire and the bourgeoisie in the 19th century. Any analysis of the process that gave rise to these extensive changes on all levels of culture might well begin with the military situation. In the Second Age of Conflict, the best available weapons in Western civilization were artillery, muskets, and pikes, or bayonets. These were difficult to use and usually expensive to obtain. As a result, they could be used only by trained men and could be bought only by a relatively well-to-do entity. Such trained men had to be professional users of weapons, and the weapons had to be provided by the state or by the wealthy. All of this taken together meant that weapons were available only to a small minority of the population, and that the majority must expect, as a general rule, to yield to the authority of the minority that controlled these weapons. Thus it followed, almost as a matter of course, that the political level had to be authoritarian. The organization of that authority into a dynastic monarchy was a consequence of the governmental traditions of Europe. As the system operated, it was expected that allegiance and loyalty would be given to the family of the ruling monarch in order to assure succession to his heirs. This loyalty was not really expected from all persons, but only from the significant ones, the clergy, the nobility, the chief bourgeoisie, and all guild members, and possibly from well-to-do independent peasantry. But the ordinary peasantry and the guild apprentices, as persons of little significance, were not subjects of much concern about their allegiance of loyalty. The operation of mercantilism and the social superiority of the royal bureaucracy were also dependent, if less directly, on the organization and control of the military level. Thus, the structure of all four levels, military, political, economic control, and social, was based on the military organization of professional mercenary soldiers. In the age of Napoleon, and just after it, this military organization was modified greatly into a quite new system that survived for over a century. This innovation was the mass citizen army, fighting for patriotism rather than for pay. The new organization was made possible by a series of innovations in weapons and tactics, and in military as well as political organization. In weapons, the arrival of the Industrial Revolution and of mass-produced firearms based on interchangeable parts lowered the cost of weapons at the same time that the general economic expansion was raising standards of living. These two intersecting factors made it possible for the average man, in areas where these factors were operating, to obtain guns at a cost that he could afford to pay, that is, no more than his earning power over a few weeks. These guns were becoming easier to use by the shift from spark ignition to percussion ignition and breech loading. All these innovations made it possible to arm large masses of men at relatively low cost. At the same time, the shift to such a mass army was made possible by changes in political organization. The political organization that we have called dynastic monarchy could continue only so long as the best weapon available in the society could be obtained only by a minority. As soon as a majority could obtain the best available weapon and use it with little training, it became impossible for any minority to enforce obedience on a majority, and accordingly the authoritarian structure of political life began to crumble. A reorganization of political life became necessary. This reorganization of the political structure had a double aspect. On the one hand, it became necessary to shift from minority rule to majority rule, and on the other hand, it became necessary to find a new political organization that could place its appeal to allegiance on a basis that could be used for the majority of the society. This new basis was nationalism, and the new organization which succeeded the dynastic state in the early 19th century is known as the national state, prevalent from about 1800 to about 1950. The political shift from dynastic monarchy to national state, and the shift in weapons from a professional mercenary army to a mass army of citizens, allowed the cost of a man's service to be reduced, since he fought for patriotism instead of for money, and permitted a great change in military tactics, since patriotic men were more willing to die than were mercenary soldiers. The older tactics of the dynastic monarchs had favored wars of maneuvers with limited forces for limited aims. By wars of maneuver, we mean tactics in which enemy forces were dislodged from their positions by cutting their communications and supplies, rather than by assault, with battles occurring only rarely and chiefly from accidental collisions during shifts of position. Such wars were long drawn out with few battles and could be ended at any time by negotiation because of the possibility of compromising the combatants' limited and concrete goals. The advent of patriotic mass armies made it possible to force the enemy from his position by assault rather than by maneuver. The new tactics worked out by Napoleon in the period 1795 to 1815 organized this assault in 3 steps: artillery barrage, bayonet attack by infantry, and cavalry pursuit. All 3 steps were innovations, but the greatest change was in the second, where the bayonet was entirely transformed from its earlier role as a defensive weapon against cavalry to an offensive weapon against opposing infantry. It was the nature of this second and central step in the new tactics that made necessary the innovations in the use of artillery and cavalry in the 2 other steps. The possibility of heavy casualties in the second step of the new tactics, in which bayonets were sent against firepower, made it necessary to obtain very high morale from citizen soldiers. This high morale could not be obtained so long as the aims of war remained, as in the earlier period, limited and concrete. They had to be made unlimited and idealistic: saving the revolution, or civilization, making the world safe for democracy, freedom of the seas, rights of small nations, and similar unobtainable abstractions. Such goals could not be compromised, and accordingly battles had to become conflicts of annihilation in which the survival of the contending regimes was at stake. Such battles of annihilation led to a series of brief one-battle wars, such as the French-Austrian War of 1859, the Prussian-Austrian War of 1866, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, the Russo-Turkish War of 1877, and the Spanish-American War of 1899. Even as this pattern was being established, however, new forces were arising that led to the basis for quite a different pattern in the 20th century. These new forces were 1. The growing importance of ideological forces, which made it less likely that the people would accept the consequences of death in a single battle, and 2. The growing strength of the tactical defensive, which made it less necessary to yield to such a defeat in one battle. The growing ideological influence was clearly evident in the American Civil War, the struggle with the French guerrillas, and the Paris Commune after Sedan in 1871, the Boer War of 1899 to 1902, and, above all, World War I. The growing importance of the defensive made the second step of the Napoleonic battle, the bayonet offensive, less and less likely to be decisive, and made it less and less possible that the outcome of the battle itself could be decisive. The growing strength of the defensive rested on the rapid growth of firepower after the invention of the machine gun, about 1862. This made both bayonet and cavalry obsolete. The increasing use of field fortifications. This reduced the effectiveness of both artillery barrage and of offensive firepower. The invention of barbed wire, about 1879. This hampered the infantry charge of the second step and the cavalry pursuit of the third, and of the airplane in 1903. This took from the cavalry its only surviving role as reconnaissance. The tactical changes made necessary by these innovations were not recognized by military men until after they had inflicted the almost unbearable casualties of 1916 to 1917. But these changes, such as use of tanks, infiltration, aerial bombardment, and the like, made weapons once again so expensive and so difficult to use that it became increasingly needful to replace the mass citizen army by an army of specialists. Such a change, by reserving instruments of force to a minority, reversed the trend of the political level to a new development from democracy toward authoritarian government. The date of this reversal might be fixed in 1934, the year that the German general Guderian read de Gaulle's book Army of Specialists. At the same time, it became clear that rapid improvements in weapons, communications, radio, transportation, trucks, and organization made it possible to enforce obedience to orders over geographic distances far greater than those covered by any national groups. Accordingly, appeal to political allegiance on nationality grounds became obsolete, and it became necessary to make such an appeal on some much wider basis. The new basis, now in process of being discovered, was common ideological outlook. Accordingly, the stage of the national state began to be replaced by the stage of the ideological state, or bloc, on the level of political organization, and the area covered by a single political unit widened from the nation to the continental bloc. The inability of Hitler to make such a shift from a nationalist to an ideological, or other wider, basis at a time when his factual power was so much wider geographically than the area of Germanism was but one of his fatal errors. This change has been recognized in popular discussion and carried, perhaps to a degree not justified by the actual facts. We are told that we now live in a two-power world, although the power of the United States and of the Soviet Union is not in fact hemispherical. Each of these two superpowers can, it is true, obtain obedience in most matters over about 40% of the Earth's surface, but this leaves a buffer area between amounting to about a fifth of the Earth. This buffer fringe, lying between the Soviet heartland and the peripheral and ocean-linked Western civilization, is occupied by the shattered remnants of dying civilizations or the hopeful efforts of incipient new civilizations. The hope of the future does not rest, as commonly believed, in winning the peoples of the buffer fringe to one superpower or the other, but rather in the invention of new weapons and new tactics that will be so cheap to obtain and so easy to use that they will increase the effectiveness of guerrilla warfare so greatly that the employment of our present weapons of mass destruction will become futile, and, on this basis, there can be a revival of democracy and of political decentralization in all three parts of our present world. This possible development in military and political matters would of course require the development of decentralized economic techniques such as could arise if sunlight became the chief energy source of production, and the advance of science made it possible to manufacture any desired substance by molecular rearrangement of such common materials as seawater, plant fibers, and ordinary earth. Hopes such as these are far in the future, and could be fulfilled only if 1. A showdown conflict between the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc is indefinitely postponed, and 2. The structural problems of Western civilization and the no less critical problems of the Soviet Union are solved. Here we shall consider only the situation in our own society. The third age of expansion of Western civilization began to draw to its close at the end of the 19th century. By 1890, the rate of general expansion had begun to decrease, giving rise to acute crises in industry, agriculture, labor relations, political action, and international relations. These crises culminated in the beginning of a new third age of conflict in Western civilization. Third age of conflict. The third age of conflict of our society began to display the ordinary marks of such a stage about 1890. At that time, in the principal industrial countries, it became clear that the rate of expansion had reversed itself. This led to a frenzied effort by businessmen to organize in cartels and trade associations in order to keep prices above competitive levels and to share shrinking markets rather than to compete, as formerly, for new ones. Along with this went loud demands for tariff protection and all kinds of restrictive agreements, tacit or explicit, restricting new investment or entry of new enterprises into an activity. Increased pressure was put on governments to favor industrialists, and business organizations were formed to fight labor demands for any larger share of the goods being produced. At the same time, Labor and agriculture were reacting in a similar fashion, forming political pressure groups or even political parties, and seeking common action to raise prices, divide markets, exclude foreign competition, and to strike back at organized industry, finance, or transportation. While these activities were occurring as symptoms for the usual decline in the rate of expansion and of the growing class conflicts associated with an age of conflict, the other marks of such a period were no less obvious. Imperialist wars developed from epidemic to endemic status in our culture, beginning perhaps with the Boer War and the Spanish-American War, but rapidly expanding into a cycle of international stress and crises in which we still live. At the same time, on the intellectual level occurred a great upsurging of irrationality. This latter development is associated with the eager acceptance of the theories of men like Freud, Bergson, or Sorel, and culminated in the utterly irrational activism of Hitler, Mussolini, and many lesser persons. All the characteristics of an age of irrationality began to appear on all sides: increased gambling, increased smoking, the growing use of alcohol and narcotics, a growing obsession with sex and perversions of sex, an increasing mania for speed, for nervous tension, and for noise. Above all, perhaps, a growing tendency to regard violence as a solution for all problems, be they domestic, social, economic, ideological, or international. In fact, violence as a symbol of our growing irrationality has had an increasing role in activity for its own sake, when no possible justification could be made that the activity was seeking to solve a problem. All these characteristics of any age of conflict are too obvious to require further comment. They arose, as is usual in an age of conflict, because the organizational patterns of our culture ceased to function as instruments, but had become institutionalized. This process was evident on all levels of culture. Religious organizations no longer linked men to God, but adopted diverse, mundane purposes. Our intellectual theories no longer explained anything or made us at home in the universe. Our social patterns no longer satisfied our gregarious needs, even when we fled from the lonely anonymity of the city to the rat race uniformity of suburbanism. Our political organizations increased the burden of their demands on our time, energy, and wealth, but provided with growing ineffectiveness the justice, public order, education, protection, or incidental amenities we had come to expect from them. And on the military level, costs rose at an astronomical rate without being able to catch up with our increasing danger. The core of our problems could be placed in any one of the levels we have mentioned. Indeed, there might be good grounds for arguing that the root of our problem was our success in making life an end rather than a means to something higher. But in this civilization, as in others, it will be convenient to discuss the problem of our age of conflict in terms of the institutionalization of our instrument of expansion. In an earlier chapter, we discussed this phenomenon as an example of the process in general. See Chapter 5. At that time, we said that the economic organization had become institutionalized by taking on purposes of its own, separate from the purposes of the organization as a whole. The purpose of any economic system is to produce, distribute, and consume goods. If it can do this at an increasing rate, within limits, so much the better. Our economic system performed these functions more effectively than any other in history by organizing itself around a profit motivation within a price structure. As it became institutionalized, profits became an end in themselves to the jeopardy of production, distribution, and consumption. The change arose because profits could be maximized only by increasing the margin between selling prices and costs of production. But high selling prices and high profit margins with low costs of production tended to reduce consumption of goods. And low consumption of goods, at a time when production figures were constantly setting new maximum records, could only result in rising inventories and an indigestion of distribution that was bound to make goods back up to the factories to smother production. This situation arose from a number of factors. During the 13th century, production had been emphasized in such a way as to distort the economic system as a whole, since such a system must also include distribution and consumption. Moreover, within the productive system, the pursuit of profits had been emphasized to the neglect of any of the other necessary parts of the productive process. Put briefly, profits had become an end rather than a means. One consequence of this failure in coordination of the economic system as a whole, and the even greater failure to coordinate the economic system in the civilization as a whole, had been the growth of a very inequitable distribution of the wealth produced by the economic system. Such an inequitable distribution of wealth was a very excellent thing, as long as lack of capital was prevalent in the economic system. But such a maldistribution of income ceases to be an advantage as soon as the productive system has developed out of all proportion to the processes of distribution and of consumption. In the United States, according to the National Industrial Conference Board, the richest one-fifth of our population received 46.2% of the national income in 1910, 51.3% of it in 1929, and 48.5% in 1937. In the same 3 years, the share of the poorest one-fifth of the population fell from 8.3% to 5.4% to 3.6%. Thus, the ratios between the portion obtained by the richest one-fifth and that obtained by the poorest one-fifth increased in the 3 years mentioned from 5.6 to 9.3 to 13.5. If indeed of 1/5 we examine the ratios between the percentage obtained by the richest 1/10 and the poorest 1/10 in the same 3 years, we find that this ratio was 10 in 1910, was 21.7 in 1929, and reached 34.4 in 1937. To some extent, this situation was made worse by the growing separation in the more advanced industrial areas between ownership and control of corporations, since this led to an increased accumulation of undistributed profits held by the corporations in control of the management rather than distributed as dividends to the owners. Such undistributed profits became savings with no possibility of serving as consumer purchasing power. These factors and a number of others that we have not space to mention here lead to a situation where increasing proportions of the national income were going to those persons in the community who would be likely to save, and decreasing portions were going to those persons in the community who would spend their incomes for consumers' goods. This situation could continue as long as all the savings made by the former group were invested in new capital or otherwise spent, because these actions would distribute such savings to persons who would use their incomes to buy goods. Only under these conditions, that all savings be invested or spent, could all goods produced be sold. The last statement can be expressed in a simple arithmetical relationship. In any single firm, the total selling price of the goods produced is equal to the sum of their costs of production and their profits. In the economic community as a whole, the aggregation of the selling prices of all firms will be the sum of aggregate costs plus aggregate profits. The incomes of the community as a whole are the same as the aggregate of the selling prices of all goods, because these profits and costs of each firm are the incomes of those to whom they are paid. If savings are held back from these incomes, the purchasing power available to purchase the goods being offered for sale will be reduced below the prices being asked. Thus, total prices equal total costs plus profits. Total incomes equal total costs plus profits. Therefore, total prices equal total incomes. But available purchasing power equal incomes minus savings plus investment. Accordingly, the purchasing power available to buy the goods being offered at the prices being asked will be inadequate unless all savings are invested. During the World Depression of 1929 to 1938, all savings were not invested because there was no point in spending money on new capital plant so long as the goods being produced by the existing capital plant were going unsold because of the inequitable flow of incomes into the control of persons who wished to save rather than into the control of those who wished to consume. This crisis of the system was intensified by a number of other factors, notably the deflationary influence of a monetary system tied to a limited supply of gold under conditions of power production of goods. As a consequence, the crisis was accompanied by a drastic price deflation that eventually led to a banking crisis and the end of the international gold standard. The date of this last event could be fixed at September 21, 1931, when sterling, which had been the center of the whole world's financial network for more than a century, went off gold. Succinctly, the banking crisis arose when prices of goods fell so low that banks could not liquidate collateral fast enough and at high enough prices to provide sufficient funds to meet the demands made on their reserves. As confidence in the banking system decreased, demands rose, reserves fell, and the liquidation of collateral could not keep up with either. Accordingly, banks could not fulfill their obligations and had to close their doors, go bankrupt, or call upon governments for help. The net result was the end of financial capitalism. This shift from financial capitalism to monopoly capitalism was made possible by the very means that bankers developed for their control of business firms. As we have seen, business firms came to bankers to obtain capital and were bound to remain under banking influence as long as their need for outside capital continued. To ensure continued banking control of these firms, bankers used such mechanisms as interlocking directorships, holding companies, consolidations, and controlled banking services. But these methods of banking control, by reducing competition between firms, made it possible to seek profits by raising prices rather than by decreasing costs, and thus made it possible for such firms to become self-financing of their own capital needs, and accordingly to be freed from banking control. In the earlier period, a firm could not seek profits by raising prices because both competition with other firms and the limited supply of money anchored to the limited supply of gold made it difficult to raise prices of any individual product. Accordingly, profits, which are the margin between prices and cost, had to be sought by reducing costs. This need, incidentally, placed the interest of labor in opposition to management, since wages formed the chief item in costs. Management, thus, in the periods of industrial capitalism and in the following period of financial capitalism, was almost inevitably opposed to the unionization of labor. But once financial capitalism had brought considerable elements of monopoly into the picture, as J.P. Morgan did when he organized the United States Steel Corporation, decreased competition made it possible to increase profits by raising prices faster than costs. This made it possible for firms to become self-financing out of their own profits, to dispense with bankers' flotations and biased advice, and to reduce management's opposition to unionization of labor. As industry became more heavily capitalized, wages became a decreasing portion of costs, and the value of uninterrupted use of the expensive capital plant made it advisable to avoid labor disputes and labor stoppages by allowing unionization of labor and higher wages, recovering the increased costs of higher wages by raising the increasingly non-competitive prices of the products. Thus, highly capitalized monopolistic industry became an exploitation of the absent consumer by management and labor jointly. At approximately the same time, the end of the international gold standard freed the supply of money from its dependence on the limited supply of gold, and from the maldistribution of gold arising from the bankers' mismanagement of the gold standard, and thus made it possible for prices to be raised, perhaps indefinitely, by joint labor management actions. And finally, in the same context of events, the pressure to raise wages was increased by the desire to provide increased purchasing power to buy the growing flood of goods being produced. The shift from financial capitalism to monopoly capitalism made possible a new period of expansion in Western civilization. But before that new mechanism could be used for expansive purposes, the institutionalization of the previous organization of financial capitalism had thrown the whole society into an age of conflict. It is not yet clear if the society will be destroyed as a consequence of this, or if it will be able to straighten itself on a new course of expansion. The structure of the new system is entirely different from that which existed in the period of financial capitalism before 1929. In that earlier period, the two chief differences were: one, that the whole economic system was dominated by bankers and financiers, especially by investment bankers, and two, that as a result, the system had a financial mechanism that was basically deflationary because the volume of money was determined, in the final analysis, by the limited supply of gold. As a consequence of the first of these characteristics, the lines of prestige and influence in the system passed away from financiers to heavy industry, and then to light industry and commerce, after which they were diffused among petty bourgeois clerks, farmers, laborers, bureaucrats, and service workers. As a consequence of the world depression, finance was reduced to a subordinate role, and a struggle arose about the arrangement of the other groups. In fascist states, industry, commerce, and petty bourgeois, by abolishing any forms of political democracy, sought to establish authoritarian regimes in which industry, with its allies, could exploit farmers, laborers, and consumers in general, in order to favor producers in general. In New Deal and democratic states, this did not occur, but instead labor, farmers, commercial groups, and to some extent consumers in general, were strengthened, and all groups, including reduced finance, became satellites around the governmental system. The control of money supply, which had been one of the chief attributes of the banking group before 1929, became an attribute of the government after 1945, and the government exercised its control under pressure from the shifting alliances and alignments of the great economic power blocks that surrounded it. These blocks came to include 1. Finance, 2. Heavy industry, 3. Light industry, 4. Commercial and service groups, such as real estate, 5. Civil servants, 6. The armed services, 7. Labor, 8. Farmers, 9. Transportation and others. If any one or several of these blocks became too obviously exploitative of the others form an alignment to pressurize the government in another direction. The chief consequence of such alignments and pressures has been to increase government spending and thus to increase inflation. In general, all these pressures have sought to achieve some redistribution of economic resources among the three chief claimants of these resources. These three are consumption, capital accumulation, and government services, including defense. In the financial capitalist system before 1929, the great danger had been the great diversion of resources toward capital accumulation to the jeopardy of the two others. In the new pluralistic system that had arisen, the great danger, in many countries, has been toward increasing consumption to the jeopardy of capital accumulation and public service. This danger has frequently appeared as a tendency toward inflation that would destroy capital accumulation by destroying savings. At the present time, it is too early to judge if the present crisis of Western civilization will resolve itself into a new fourth age of expansion, or will continue through an age of conflict to a universal empire and ultimately to decay and invasion. In any case, the immediate future seems to offer to Western society a culture in which, on various levels, an army of specialists serves an ideological state, supported by a pluralist economy, regulated by planning, both public and private, in a society in which the dominant social class is made up of managers, rather than owners, bankers, voters, or others. In this culture, the nature of the intellectual and religious levels will depend on whether the whole system continues in a period of conflict or turns toward a new age of expansion.